They told me the tower had been dead for more than a decade before they sent me to listen to it. That's the part I keep coming back to, the part that should have stopped me before I ever drove out there. A relay station that had not transmitted since 2013. No power feed, no maintenance contract, scheduled for demolition, and yet there was a work order with my name on it, generated by a system that was not supposed to generate anything for that site anymore. By the time I understood why, the tower had already started taking pieces of me. I've thought about it every night since. I've turned it over like a key in my pocket, long after forgetting which door it was supposed to open, and I still don't understand it. I want to be honest about that before I tell you anything else. I am not a man who understands what happened to him. I am only a man who can't stop hearing it. My name doesn't matter much for this, but I'll give it to you anyway. Because leaving it out feels like the start of disappearing, and I've seen what disappearing looks like up close now. Daniel. I was a field inspector for a contractor that handled decommissioning surveys for old telecom infrastructure across 3 counties in the eastern part of the state. It's not glamorous work. You drive to a site, you photograph the structure, you note rust, fence damage, equipment decay, and signs of trespass. You fill out a form. You drive home. Most days I never spoke to another living person between leaving my apartment and getting back to it. I'd been doing it for 4 years when the order came through, and I'll tell you plainly that I took the job because I was the kind of person it suited. I liked being alone. I had gotten very good at being alone. That turned out to matter more than I knew. The order came in on a Tuesday in late September. I remember because I'd just renewed my truck's registration, and the sticker was sitting on my dashboard. And I keep that image because it's so ordinary, so anchored to a normal life, that I use it now to remind myself I was a real person with a real Tuesday before any of this. The site code was one I didn't recognize. Most of our sites had clean alphanumeric tags tied to the county grid. This one was just a string of digits that didn't parse, and a location pin that landed in a stretch of pine and old logging clear-cut about 90 minutes northeast, past the last gas station, past the last town with a stoplight, out where the road numbers get longer and the signs start losing letters to rust. I called the office. I want you to know I did the normal thing first. I always did the normal thing first, every step of the way, and I think that's part of why it chose me, because I was the kind of man who checks. A woman named Patrice handled dispatch, had for years, knew the systems better than anyone. I asked her about the code, and she went quiet on the line for a second, and then she said something I've replayed 1,000 times. She said, "That site's flagged closed. There shouldn't be an order on it." And I said, "Well, there is. It has my name on it." And she said she'd look into it and call me back. She called me back 40 minutes later and told me to go ahead and run the inspection, but her voice had changed. She said it had probably been generated by a sync error when they migrated the old database, and that the demolition crew needed a current condition report before they could pull the permit anyway, so I might as well make the trip count. Then, just before hanging up, she said, "Daniel, if anything feels wrong out there, don't try to prove it doesn't." That was the explanation. A sync error. A database hiccup. I want to underline how reasonable that was, how easily I accepted it, because everything that happened afterward, I accepted the same way, one reasonable step at a time, until I was somewhere no reasonable step could have taken me. I drove out the next morning. It was one of those clear, cold autumn days where the light comes in low and hard, and everything looks sharper than it should. The kind of day that makes you trust your own eyes. The drive was beautiful in a forgotten way. You leave the highway and the world thins out. The houses get further apart, and then there are no houses, just mailboxes standing at the ends of dirt tracks leading to nothing you can see. The radio in my truck went to static around the 40-minute mark, and I turned it off, the way you do. I had a thermos of coffee and a clipboard and a digital camera and a paper map because the GPS had stopped being sure of itself, and I remember this clearly, I felt fine. I felt good, even. I liked these long, empty drives. They were the closest I came to peace. I should tell you one thing about my life before the tower, because the story does not work without it. I was 38, alone by habit, and better at silence than I was at people. Most of my childhood had faded into a handful of images. A screen door, porch steps, my mother's voice somewhere in the house, my sister Hannah laughing before life taught her not to. I thought forgetting was normal. I think it probably is. The sight appeared the way these sights always do, all at once, after a curve. The trees opened into a clearing maybe 200 yards across, and there it was, a steel lattice tower, the old kind, a self-supporting truss, maybe 180 feet tall, with an equipment shed at the base and a sagging chain-link fence around the whole thing. Everything about it said abandoned. The fence was overgrown. The gate hung crooked, chained once, but the rusted chain had snapped years ago and lay in the weeds like a dead snake. No lock was left, only the orange stain where one had been. The shed door had a faded sticker warning of high voltage that nobody had needed to read in over a decade. There were no power lines coming in. I noted that immediately, the way you'd note anything wrong, because it was the most basic fact, and it was already impossible. No power lines, no generator hum, no solar array, no battery bank visible through the shed's broken window. Nothing to make electricity, and nothing to make it with. A dead tower in a dead field. I parked the truck and got out, and the silence was enormous. That's the only word for it. Out there, the silence has weight. It presses on your ears, and after the engine ticked itself cool, there was nothing, no birds, no wind, even though the trees had been moving on the drive-in. I stood by the truck for a second, taking it in, and I told myself it was a beautiful kind of quiet. I told myself a lot of things that day. I did my walk around first. I pushed the crooked gate open and listened to it drag through the weeds. I photographed the four faces of the tower. I checked for guy anchors out of habit, then corrected the old file. The tower was self-supporting. There were no anchors to photograph. I photographed the fence line, the gate, and the shed exterior. Standard. I'd done it 1,000 times. And then I went to the shed because the condition report needed an interior assessment. And the shed door wasn't locked, just stuck, swollen in its frame. And I put my shoulder into it, and it gave with a sound like something exhaling. Inside, it was what I expected. Dead equipment. Racks of old transmission gear furred with dust, cable trays sagging, a workbench with a coffee mug still on it. the mug holding an inch of something black and dried at the bottom. Mouse droppings, the smell of cold metal and mildew. A wall calendar from 2013 turned to a month nobody had ever flipped past. I started cataloging, photographing the equipment tags, and that's when I heard it. It was very faint at first. So faint I thought it was my own ears, the ringing you get in deep silence. A thread of sound coming from the racks, from one of the dead units. I stopped and held my breath, and it was still there, and it wasn't ringing. It was a voice. It was a child's voice, far away and indistinct, like a radio turned almost all the way down. Under it was another sound, one I knew before I could name. A screen door. The specific slap and bounce of a screen door on a spring, and then a woman's voice calling a name, and the name was Danny, which is what my mother called me, which is what nobody had called me in 20 years. I want to tell you I ran. I didn't run. I stood there with my camera in my hand, and I tried to be reasonable. I thought, there's a phone somewhere, somebody's phone left on, playing a video. I thought, there's another crew here, a kid wandered in, sound carries strangely in metal buildings. I went down the row of racks looking for a speaker, a screen, a source. The closer I got to the unit, the clearer it became. And the clearer it became, the worse it was, because it was not a recording of just any childhood. The woman's voice was my mother's. I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. And she was calling me in for dinner, and a screen door was slapping, and a dog was barking, and we never had a dog, except we did, for one summer when I was 9. A stray that stayed 3 months and then got hit on the county road, and I had not thought about that dog in 30 years. I had genuinely forgotten that dog existed until I heard it barking out of a dead machine in a field in the middle of nowhere. The unit it was coming from had no power light. I touched it. It was cold. I pulled the rack panel and traced the cable, and the cable went into a junction that went nowhere, that had been cut, the copper inside green with age. There was no power going to that machine. There was no power going to anything in that shed, and it was playing my mother's voice. I left the shed, I'll admit that. I walked out into the clearing, and I stood in the sun, and I made myself breathe, and I told myself the most reasonable thing I could think of, which was that I was tired, that I'd been driving in silence too long, that the mind does things in deep quiet, fills the empty channel with whatever it has lying around, and what it had lying around was my own past. That's a real phenomenon. I'd read about it. Sensory deprivation, the brain generating phantom sound. I held on to that explanation with both hands, and then, standing there in the open with nothing around me for miles, I heard it again, outside now, coming from above, and I looked up at the tower. The sound was coming down the tower, from the top, faint, the same thread of childhood, the screen door, the dog, my mother. And then a new sound joined it that made my legs go weak. It was me, a little boy's voice, my voice. I knew it the way you'd know a photograph of your own face, saying something I couldn't quite make out, laughing, calling back to my mother that I was coming, and then a sound I will hear until the day I die, the sound of my sister Hannah laughing. Hannah at maybe 6 years old, shrieking with laughter the way kids do, and saying my name, saying, "Danny, Danny, watch this," And I stood in that field and I started to cry without deciding to, because Hannah had been dead for 9 years. I need to tell you about Hannah now because, everything after this is really about Hannah, even the parts that aren't. My sister died when she was 29. She had a hard adulthood. Things I won't lay out in detail because they're hers and not mine to broadcast. But the short version is that she struggled the way some people struggle with the kind of pain that doesn't have an edge you can point to, and she fought it for a long time. And then one winter, she stopped fighting it. I was the one who found her. I'd driven down because she hadn't answered her phone in 2 days, and I had a key. I won't describe it. I'll only tell you that for 9 years, I had carried the absolute certainty that I should have known, that the signs were there and I had been too wrapped up in my own small life to read them, that if I had called 1 day earlier, driven down 1 day sooner, paid attention the way a brother is supposed to, she would still be alive. That guilt was the central fact of my life. It was the reason I lived alone. It was the reason I liked the long, silent drives, because in the silence, I didn't have to perform being okay for anybody. I had built my entire existence around the careful management of a grief I had never once let anybody see. And now her voice was coming down a steel tower in a dead field, 6 years old and laughing, calling my name. I got in my truck. I want to be clear that I did the reasonable thing, the only sane thing. I started the engine and I turned around and I drove away. I didn't finish the inspection. I left the gate open. I drove the 90 minutes back through the thinning, then thickening world, and the radio came back to life around the same point it had died. And I listened to a man read the weather, and I held onto his voice like a railing. When I got back into cell range, my phone buzzed with the day's messages, and I pulled over and sat in a gas station lot, and I called Patrice, and I told her the site was unsafe, structurally compromised, that I couldn't complete the interior assessment, which was a lie, and that they should send a 2-person crew if they sent anyone at all, which was the truth. She was quiet again, the way she'd been quiet the first time. And then she asked me something that I didn't understand then and understand all too well now. She asked, "Did you hear anything out there, Daniel?" Not see, heard. And I lied to her. I said no. And there was a long pause, and she said, "Okay, write it up as unsafe. I'll close the order." And she hung up before I could ask her why she'd asked. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my apartment with every light on like a child, and I told myself it was a hallucination, a breakdown, that I'd been carrying too much for too long, and it had finally come out sideways. That explanation almost held. It would have held, I think, if I'd never gone back. But I want you to understand something about grief that nobody tells you, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. When you have spent 9 years certain that you failed someone you loved, and then you hear that someone's voice, alive and laughing, and from before all the pain, some animal part of you doesn't care whether it's real. Some animal part of you just wants to get back to it. By 3 a.m, I had stopped trying to convince myself the tower was broken. By dawn, I had started trying to convince myself it was a gift. I went back on Friday. I told the office I was doing a site I'd skipped earlier in the week, which was its own kind of lie, and I drove out alone again, and this time I'd brought things. I'd brought a battery-powered radio scanner I'd had since I was an amateur enthusiast in my 20s, the kind that sweeps frequencies. I'd brought a notebook. I'd brought, God help me, an old photograph of Hannah and me as kids that I kept in a drawer and almost never looked at. The two of us on the porch steps of the house we grew up in, squinting into the sun. I think I brought it because some part of me wanted to show the tower I knew what it was doing. Or maybe I wanted to show Hannah I'd kept it. I don't know. Grief makes you do things that don't have reasons. The clearing was the same. The gate was still open from where I'd left it. The silence still had its weight. I sat in the truck for a while with the scanner on my lap, and I turned it on and let it sweep, and the numbers rolled and rolled across empty static. The whole band dead the way it should be out there. And then around a frequency that the display showed as a string of digits that wasn't a real broadcast frequency, that was lower than anything that's supposed to carry voice. The scanner locked. It just stopped sweeping and locked. And out of the little speaker came a kitchen. That's the only way I can describe it. Not a recording of a kitchen. A kitchen. The dimensional fullness of a room. The clink of dishes. Water running. My mother humming something tuneless, the way she did when she thought no one was listening. The specific creak of the third floorboard from the stove that I had forgotten existed, and that came back to me complete and certain the instant I heard it. I sat in my truck in that field, and I was 9 years old in my mother's kitchen, and the smell, I swear to you I could smell it. The smell of the gas burner and onions and the particular mustiness of that house. And I started shaking, and I was not afraid yet. That's the terrible part. I wasn't afraid. I was home. The voices came and went. Sometimes it was my mother, sometimes my father, lower, further off, the rumble of him reading the paper and clearing his throat. Sometimes me. The small high voice of me, and sometimes Hannah. And I noticed, sitting there listening for what must have been an hour, I noticed something that should have sent me running, and instead pulled me deeper. The childhood it was broadcasting was not quite my childhood. It was close. It was 99% right. But there were small things wrong. In the kitchen, my mother called me to dinner and said we were having pot roast, and we never had pot roast on. I knew this somehow. We never had it on a weeknight, and the light coming through the scanner's audio, the quality of the afternoon in it, was a summer light, but pot roast was a winter meal, and these two things didn't fit together, and the wrongness of it was so subtle and so specific that it frightened me more than the impossibility of the whole thing. Because a hallucination would have gotten it right. My own memory would have gotten it right. This was someone, something. Assembling my childhood from the outside, with access to nearly everything but not quite all of it. Getting the screen door perfect and the dog perfect and the floorboard perfect, and then putting pot roast on a summer Tuesday, because it didn't actually know us, it only had us. I turned the scanner off. My hands were not steady. And in the silence after, the real silence of the real field, I heard the tower again, the way I had the first day, the faint thread of it coming down the steel from above, except now, it wasn't faint. It had grown. 2 days I'd been gone, and it had grown, and now I could hear it without the scanner, plain in the air, and what it was broadcasting was not the kitchen anymore. It was the county road, the specific stretch of county road where the stray dog died, where 3 years after that, when I was 12, I'd been riding my bike and seen something I had spent my whole life not thinking about, and the tower was playing it, the sound of it. A car, too fast, and the wet, heavy sound, and a man getting out and saying, oh God, oh no, and me, 12 years old, dropping my bike in the gravel and not knowing what to do, and the thing I had buried, the thing I had never told anyone, the secret I didn't even let myself remember, which was that I had seen the car coming, and I had seen the boy on the other bike, the Henley kid younger than me, and I had had just enough time to yell, and I hadn't. I'd frozen. I'd watched, and a boy died on that road, and I never told a soul that I might have been able to warn him, and I had folded that memory up so small and pushed it so deep that I had genuinely, truthfully forgotten it for 26 years, until a dead radio tower in an empty field unfolded it and played it back to me in the cold autumn air. That was when I understood the pattern. The first time, it gave me comfort. The second time, it gave me proof. Then it gave me guilt. It was not broadcasting my childhood. It was letting out line. It started with the warmth, the kitchen, the laughing, the parts I would want to come back for. Once I came back, it moved on to the buried things, the things I had hidden even from myself. And the Henley boy had to have come from me. There was no recording of that, no database, no witness who could have known what I had not even allowed myself to remember. The tower had been inside me, which meant the listening went both ways. I should have run again. I did run again that second day. I drove home. I did not sleep. At sunrise, I sat at my kitchen table and forced myself to think like an inspector, like a man who fills out forms. And the form, when I filled it out honestly, said something I couldn't bear. It said the tower wasn't broadcasting at me. It was broadcasting through me. It was using my memory as its material, mining me. And the deeper it went, the more it took. And the more it took, the more I lost. Because here's the thing I noticed on that second sleepless night. The thing that finally made me afraid in the right way. I tried to remember the kitchen on my own, without the scanner, without the tower. I tried to hear my mother's humming, the floorboard, the dog. I couldn't. Then I looked at the photograph of Hannah and me on the porch, and for 1 second I could not remember which child was me. The memory was gone, not faded. Gone the way a tooth is gone, a hole where a thing used to be. I only knew the floorboard had existed because I remembered the tower playing it. The tower was not showing me my childhood. It was taking it. It left a copy in its place, a copy that lived in the tower. So the only way to revisit my own life was to go back out to that field and let it play me back to myself, a little more worn each time, like a tape copied from a copy. I want to talk about why it was me. I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I think the answer is the worst part of the whole story. I called Patrice the following Monday. I didn't tell her what was happening. I asked her, carefully, about the site's history, who had inspected it before, whether other orders had ever been generated for it after it closed. And she was quiet in that way she had. And then she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She told me to meet her for coffee, off the clock, away from the office. We met at a diner halfway between my place and hers, and she looked at me across the table like a woman deciding whether to say something she'd promised herself she never would, and then she told me. She said the site had generated orders before. Not many. Maybe one every couple of years, going back further than the records that were supposed to exist for a dead site. And every order had a name on it. and every name belonged to someone who, she said, fit a certain profile, though it had taken her years to see it because the company churned through field inspectors, and she'd only stayed long enough to notice the pattern. The names belonged to people who worked alone, people with no emergency contact listed, or an emergency contact that was a parent who died, or a sibling, a spouse, someone gone. People, she said, choosing the word carefully, who were carrying something. She didn't know how she knew that last part. She said you could just tell from the way they were when they came back. If they came back, some of them put in for transfers right after, some of them quit. One of them, years ago, a man named Errol something, had finished the inspection and driven home, and that was the last anybody heard. His truck found later, parked neatly at the trailhead of a state park 40 miles away. No note, no body, just the truck and his clipboard on the seat and the radio in it tuned to static. And then she told me the thing that I still can't get out from under. She said she'd been the dispatcher who sent Errol, and she'd never forgiven herself because she'd had a feeling and she'd ignored it, the way you ignore feelings when there's a work order and a permit deadline and a system that says go. And when my order came through with my name on it, she said she'd recognized the site code in her gut before her mind caught up, and she'd told me to go anyway, because what was she going to say? That a dead tower picks people. She'd told me to go, and then she'd spent a week sick about it, and when I called and asked if I had heard anything out there, that was her trying to ask the only question that mattered without admitting she knew the answer. I asked her why she didn't just refuse to dispatch it, delete the order. And she looked at me with an expression I'll never forget, and she said, I tried that with Errol's after. I deleted it from the system. It came back. It comes back with a new name. I think if I deleted yours, it would have just picked someone else, someone who didn't get warned at all. She was telling me she had let it have me to spare a stranger. The terrible part was that I understood the logic. I had made versions of that calculation my whole life, choosing the path that hurt the fewest people and counting myself as no one. We sat there, two people who had each privately decided we were the acceptable loss, and neither of us said it out loud, and the coffee went cold, and that was the most honest conversation I have ever had with another human being. I didn't go back for 2 weeks after that. I tried to live. I'll spare you the details of those 2 weeks, except to say that they were the loneliest of my life, because I was discovering, day by day, the cost of what had already happened. The memories the tower had taken on those 2 visits did not come back. I would reach for some piece of my own past, the way you do without thinking, and find a hole. I couldn't remember my mother's face anymore. I could remember that I used to be able to remember it. I had the photograph, the one of Hannah and me on the porch, and I looked at it, and I knew the woman who must have taken it was my mother, but I could not assemble her in my mind, and when I tried, the only image that came was a kind of static, the sense of a person, the warmth of a person, with the actual person scooped out. And I understood that the tower had her now, that if I drove out there and sat in the field, I could hear her hum and feel the kitchen and have her back for an hour. And that this was exactly the trap, that every visit would give me back a little of what it had taken while taking a little more, until there was nothing left of me that wasn't out there in the steel. And then, I supposed, I would do what Errol did. I would drive somewhere quiet and leave my truck and walk into the rest of it, because a man who is mostly in the tower already might as well go be with the rest of himself. Here is the thing that broke me, the thing that sent me back the last time. I started losing Hannah, not the tower Hannah, the 6-year-old laughing on the county road, the real one, the grown woman, my sister, the hard adulthood, the winter she stopped fighting, the apartment, the key in my hand. I felt it going the way you feel a fever coming on, a wrongness at the edges. One night I tried to picture her face, her adult face, the face I'd seen for the last time on the worst day of my life, and it wouldn't come. And I panicked, because that grief, that guilt, that certainty that I'd failed her, it was the load-bearing wall of my entire self. I had built everything on it. The solitude, the long drives, the careful management. If the tower took Hannah, took the guilt, I didn't know what would be left standing. I didn't know who I'd be without the weight I'd been carrying for 9 years, and some part of me, some exhausted part of me, whispered that maybe that would be a mercy. Maybe the tower was offering to take the worst thing I owned. Maybe I should let it. That whisper is the most dangerous thing I have ever heard, including everything that came out of that tower, because I understood, finally, fully what it fed on. It fed on people who wanted to put something down, people carrying a thing too heavy, who in their secret hearts would trade a piece of themselves to stop carrying it. It didn't take from us against our will. That was the horror of it. It took with our cooperation. It offered relief, and it dressed the relief up as our own childhood, our own warmth, and we walked toward it because we were tired, because we were alone, because grief is so heavy and the kitchen smelled so good. Patrice was right that it chose people who were carrying something. But it wasn't choosing victims. It was choosing volunteers who didn't know yet that they'd volunteer. I went back to end it. That was my actual intention. I want that on the record because it was the last clean thing I did. I told myself I would go out there and I would burn the shed and pull down whatever was making it possible, that I'd treat it like the inspection it was supposed to be and find the structural fault and correct it. I brought a gas can. I brought tools. I brought, for reasons I couldn't explain even to myself, the photograph again, the porch steps, the squinting kids. I think I wanted Hannah with me. I think I knew underneath that I was going to try to do something about Hannah, and that I was lying to myself about the gas can the way I'd lied to Patrice, the way I'd lied to myself my whole life about how okay I was. It was November by then. The clearing had turned brown and the sky was low and gray, and the silence out there had teeth. I parked. I got out with the gas can, and the tower was loud now. It had grown so much in those weeks that the whole clearing was full of it, my childhood pouring down the steel and out across the dead grass, the kitchen and the road and the porch and the dog, all of it at once, overlapping. A flood of a life, my life, playing to an empty field with no one to hear it but me. And woven all through it, brighter than any of it, was Hannah, both Hannahs now, the 6-year-old laughing and the grown woman talking. I could hear her saying things I had never heard her say. She was sorry, it was not my fault. Danny, you couldn't have known. over and over, in her real adult voice, the voice I had lost. I dropped the gas can and walked toward the tower, because of course I did. That was the thing I had needed to hear for 9 years and never would. The tower knew it. It was the most beautiful and most evil thing I have ever been given. I don't know how long I stood at the base of the tower. The light changed, so it was hours. Hannah told me it wasn't my fault in 100 different ways, and I cried, and I thanked her, and I told her things I'd never told anyone, and the tower took all of it, every word, and I could feel it taking. I could feel myself getting lighter and emptier, and it felt like grace. It felt exactly like being forgiven, and right at the end, when I was ready to lie down in that brown grass and let it have the rest, the tower made its mistake. The same kind of mistake as the pot roast on a summer Tuesday. Hannah, my Hannah, the one who had struggled so hard and so long, said my name with the wrong inflection. She said Danny the way my mother said it, the dinner call lilt, 2 notes, and Hannah never said it that way. Hannah said it flat and dry and a little mocking the way little sisters do, and the wrongness of it cut through everything like cold water. And I understood in one clear, terrible second that this was not Hannah, that Hannah was 9 years dead and would never forgive me because she was gone, and the dead don't forgive. That's the whole tragedy of them. And that the thing in the tower was wearing her badly, the way it had worn my mother and the kitchen and the road, getting the surface perfect and the soul of it just slightly, unforgivably wrong. I picked up the gas can. My hands were steady this time, and I learned the worst thing I could have learned. You cannot burn it down, because there is nothing real enough to burn. I poured the gas in the shed, and I lit it, and the equipment burned. The dead racks, the calendar, the mug, all of it, and the tower kept broadcasting. The fire did nothing. The voices came down the steel exactly the same, because the machinery was never the point. The tower wasn't a transmitter. It was an antenna, and the thing it was tuned to wasn't in the shed and wasn't in the steel. It was somewhere I can't point to, somewhere underneath everything, and the steel just gave it a shape and a place to fish from. I stood there and watched the shed burn and listened to the tower, not care, and I understood that there was no ending I could give this, no correction. No form to fill out. The fault was structural in a way no inspector could survey, so I did the only thing left. I left. I got in my truck and I drove, and I did not stop at the trailhead like Errol. I did not park neatly and walk into the trees, though I felt the pull of it. I felt how easy it would be, how restful. I drove home, and I have not gone back. That is the only victory I have, if it's a victory, that I have not gone back, and every day it costs me not to. But you need to understand what I brought home with me, because this is the part that matters, the part I'm confessing. I am not whole. The tower has most of my childhood now. I cannot picture my mother. I cannot picture our house, except as the photograph, which I keep because it's the only proof I have that any of it happened. The dog, the floorboard, the screen door, the kitchen, gone, traded for an afternoon of feeling at home. And it has the Henley boy, which is the one mercy in all of it, that the worst thing I ever did is out there in the steel, and not in here anymore, except that I can't even feel relieved about that because I know it was taken, not healed, and a guilt you can't feel isn't gone. It's just been moved somewhere it can grow in the dark. And Hannah, it has the 6-year-old, the laughing one. But here is the thing. Here's the thing I come back to every single night. It does not have the grown one. It does not have the winter, or the apartment, or the key in my hand, or the certainty that I failed her. I stopped it before it took that. The wrong inflection saved that part of me. And so I am a man who can no longer remember his sister as a child, who has only the worst of her, the ending of her, the guilt of her, and who must carry that load with no childhood underneath it to balance the weight, no laughing 6-year-old to remember her as before the pain, just the pain, just the failure, forever. And that is what I traded for. The tower offered to take my grief, and instead, it took everything around my grief and left the grief standing alone in the empty field of me, taller now, with nothing to shade it. I told Patrice some of this. She listened the way she does, and at the end, she asked me the only thing she could, which was whether I was all right. And I told her the truth, which is that I don't know what I am anymore. The order is closed. She made sure of it. But she also told me the last time we spoke that the site code generated again last week. A new order, a new name. She wouldn't tell me whose. She said she was going to try deleting it, and that we both knew what that meant, that it would just come back with another name, and that somewhere out there right now is a man or a woman who works alone and has no emergency contact, and is carrying something too heavy to keep carrying, and that a dead tower in a dead field has read this in them the way it read it in me, and is waiting, patient, with their own childhood already loaded and warm. I keep the photograph on my kitchen table now, face up, where I have to look at it. 2 kids on porch steps, squinting into a sun I can't remember the warmth of. I look at it every morning. I'm trying to memorize it before it goes to, before whatever the tower started finishes on its own, because I've noticed the holes spreading, slow, the way rust spreads on steel left out in the weather. I look at the boy in the photograph, and I know he's me, and I feel nothing, just the static, just the warmth of a person with the person scooped out. And I look at the little girl laughing next to him, and I know she's my sister, and I cannot hear her laugh anymore. I can only remember that I used to be able to, and I know exactly where her laugh is. It's 90 minutes northeast, past the last gas station, past the last town with a stoplight, out where the road signs lose their letters, coming down 180 feet of cold steel into an empty field, calling a name that isn't mine anymore, to no one. And the worst nights, the ones where the holes feel bigger, I sit at that table and I find my keys in my hand, and I don't remember picking them up, and I have to set them down very carefully and put them in a drawer and close it, because some animal part of me just wants to get back to her, and that part of me does not care what it costs. And I am learning, slowly, terribly, that the difference between me and Errol is not that I'm stronger. It's only that I haven't run out of road yet. I am telling you this so that if a work order ever comes to you for a site that is supposed to be dead, with your name on it and a code that does not parse, you will know the real question to ask. Not whether the place is dangerous. Places like that are always dangerous. Ask whether you are carrying something you would give anything to put down. Because if you are, It already knows. It is already loaded, and it sounds exactly like coming home.